Welcome to IRO Live with host Bob Bay.
We've been talking about this journey through the wilderness from an Exodus. That's the journey where they left Egypt. God came and got them out of Egypt. And then they did their journeying through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. We began talking many months ago about how each of us is on a wilderness journey. You can't avoid the wilderness journey. It's all throughout the Bible. Jesus went on a wilderness journey. Everybody has to go on their own wilderness journey. And in that process, we call that sanctification. And that is the process where God gets us ready to live in the promised land, you know, the land flowing with milk and honey. He promises in His Word that we will dwell in His kingdom. And a lot of people look at that as, well, yeah, you know, when I die, I'm going to go to heaven. But that's not what God was talking about. He was talking about living in His kingdom right here and now in the spiritual realm. And that's why Paul says we are in this world, but we are not of the world. And so spiritually, we can dwell in His kingdom, walk in the promises, live a life thriving and surviving where we're not brokenhearted all the time. We're not bound by addictions. We're not bound by depression, anxiety. We're not lost in trauma, held captive to the past, or live in fear of the future. That's not the way we were created to be. And God gave us, we talked many months ago about the needs that we all have, that God created in us, certain needs, a need for significance, a need for socialization, to have relationships, and a need for security. Not just materially, but just being secure in who we are. Secure in knowing that God loves us no matter what, and He's not going to leave us or forsake us. And it's easy to hear that in here, but do we know it in here? And do we live our lives knowing that that's the case, and that's the truth? And so this process this wilderness journey is all about bringing us to that point. And so we had gotten to the point where in Exodus, the children of Israel were at Mount Sinai. Moses had gone up and he was going up to get the 10 Commandments, but he had talked to God, and God said, listen, if you obey my voice and you keep my covenant, you will be a special people to me. Then we went on and we paralleled that, and we went on to where Jesus, in the book of Matthew, we started in 3 and 4, where Jesus started His ministry. He was baptized. He went out into the wilderness for 40 days, came back, and He started His ministry, and He began talking on the Sermon on the Mount. And He talked to us about things, about how we should live. One of the things being our perspective in life. You know, this is part of the new covenant. The old covenant was about keeping rules and our behavior on the outside. The new covenant is about the perspective we have on the inside. And that perspective, and Jesus talked about it in the Sermon on the Mount, it's the perspective we have towards the circumstances and situations that we're in. It's about how we treat the people around us. The perspective of who we see God as being and who He sees us as being. How we feel about God and how He feels about us. We learn that when God says, don't judge, lest you be judged, that biggest part of that is we can live our lives with the perspective that everybody's on their journey. And we cannot hold other people to a set of standards based on our perspective, because we're in a different place in our journey. And if we live our lives that way, then what will end up happening is other people will feel that and they'll sense that, and it will bring that back to us. Judge not, lest you be judged. If we walk around with a critical and judgmental spirit, then it's going to come back to us. And there's reasons why we don't want that, because that complicates life. That makes life hard. Another thing that we talked about is when Jesus, in the sermon, He talked about praying and give us this day our daily bread. And that's the foundation of where we live our life one day at a time. Focusing on what's going on today. That daily bread is not just food and clothing, but it's all that stuff we worry about. That thing of living with this mentality of, what if so-and-so does this next week? Will I lose my job? What if my company downsizes? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to be out of luck? Our spouses, living in both the past and the future. Coming out of addiction, I lived for a long time worrying that my past was going to catch up to me. Lies, the stealing, all of that, living a double life, I worried it was going to catch up to me because I was living in the past. In this new covenant, God is not expecting perfection. We as human beings get caught up in this idea of if I do A, B, C, and D, then God will love me. And then when I pray, He'll answer my prayers. Or when I do this thing, He's not going to strike me dead with a bolt of lightning. Or like I believed when I first came in and started going to church, I knew what was going on inside me. I was not living perfectly. I was clean and sober, but I wasn't living perfectly. I was still making dumb choices and doing dumb things. And I believed that every bad thing that happened to me was punishment as a result of those choices. And simply, most of the time, it was just the devil and the consequences of my choices catching up to me. That's what it was. As we move forward, I want to talk about expectations and how that plays in our lives. Living with the wrong expectations or living with unrealistic expectations. Expectations are good when they're healthy. It's okay to have healthy expectations. We can have the expectation that God loves us, that God wants to do good things for us, and that when we face the difficulties in life, He's here to bring us through that. And when we make mistakes, He's here to help us overcome that in all of the different ways that He does. We can have that expectation. We can have expectations. I have certain expectations on Pam, and she has certain expectations on me as being married. And we've been married for a long time, so there are certain unwritten expectations. But you know what? There are also unwritten bad expectations. I lived for a long time. Pam would say something in a certain tone of voice to me because of everything I had gone through. I automatically associated that tone of voice with what had happened in my past. And so I would assign thoughts and feelings. And that's another part of expectations, is thinking that we know what other people are thinking. Oh, when this person says it, did you see the way, they looked at me? They obviously, meant, oh, they were looking at me the wrong way. They're looking at me side-eye. They obviously are feeling like this. Or when they did that, they obviously meant this. That's all about expectations. And when we live like that, we cannot live in reality of right now. That starts carrying us into the past or into the future because of those expectations. What that does is it opens us up for torment from our souls, our mind, our will, and our emotions, or of the enemy. In this journey, we're going to go back to Exodus. When we left before, we were at Exodus 22. But we're going to go all the way back up to Exodus 34 now, because all of that stuff in between there talked about Moses was being told about, okay, this is how you're going to do the tabernacle. This is how you're going to set up tabernacle for worship. This is the 10 Commandments. This is how you treat this. This is what you do when your ox falls in a ditch. This is what happens on this. All of this, that stuff that was part of the old covenant, that's what happened in between 22 and 34. We're in the new covenant, so we went to the Sermon on the Mount because that's where Jesus covers the new covenant. We will circle back again one day because it's really cool to go back and see the references and how they connect to Genesis and Revelations and in our life today. You go to Exodus 32. I am going to read that. And let me set this up, okay? Remember when we left, Moses had come and said, listen, this is the new covenant. And he talked to them about how they were going to worship God and about keeping the commandments. Moses had known that. He didn't receive them yet on tablets, but they set a new covenant. God said, if you obey my voice and you keep the covenant, you'll be special people. What do you think? And they all said, that sounds awesome to me. Because remember, they just been through all of this stuff. that we talked about is on the journey. And they're like, that sounds awesome. Let's do that. Let's be special people. And Moses is like, cool. I'm going to go up on the mountain now, and I'm going to hang out with God for a little while, and I'm going to get some more good information, and then I'll be back down. And so he heads up. And it tells us in 22 that he goes up there for 40 days and 40 nights. But the children of Israel don't know how long he's going up there. They just know he's going up there. So it's only been 40 days. You guys, all of the stuff that we talked about, all the miracles that God did, all of that stuff, it's been 40 days. I'm going to read this for you. Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron. Remember, Aaron was Moses' number 2, and said to him, come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. And Aaron said to them, break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in the ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. Then they said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now that seems really stupid. Right? The God that parted the Red Sea, sent the quails, brought the water. But you guys have to have the backstory on what's going on during this time. And during that time in history, what would end up happening is that a group of people, be it the Israelites, be it the Babylonians, be it the Greeks, be it all these different people, they all had all these different gods, right? And they weren't stupid. They were intelligent people. So they would have these ceremonies that we refer to as mouth-opening ceremonies. Not all of them called it exactly that, but that's basically what it is. And so what they would do is they would fashion this idol, and they would have this ceremony, abracadabra, and that was supposed to open the mouth. And then this deity, this god that they had, would come and inhabit this idol. They weren't just worshiping this like piece of gold or stone or wood or whatever. They believed that their God had gone into it. They had an expectation of when Moses should be coming down and what should be happening in their lives. They got restless, and because they didn't know what was going to happen, they were afraid of what was going on. What are we going to do now? I'm sure they were all down there. What are we going to do now? Moses ain't been down here. It's been 40 days. What are we going to do now? And so they did the only thing they know to do, and that was to make a god that they could worship because they knew that God had been delivering them. But now, think about this. When we're living our lives in expectation, fear of the future, regret of the past, how often do we begin to build a god? How often have you said to yourself, yeah, I know that maybe some people say this is wrong, but wouldn't God want me to be happy? I've heard that so many times from different people. Bob, I understand that maybe you think this is wrong, but I know God would want me to be happy. And so they begin to excuse and rationalize and say, well, yeah, this is okay. That's okay. So we do that in our lives. We begin to look at the situations and circumstances in our lives, and because we have the wrong perspective, because we have the wrong idea, we have the wrong expectations, because of all of the hurt, because of the trauma that we've been through, because of the survival skills that we've developed, our coping skills that we've developed since being little kids. All of this is going on, so we begin to build a God of our understanding. I was there. When I first started going to AA, or actually I started in NA, and then when I came back to Missouri, I went to AA. God of our understanding made sense to me because the God I understood him to be was not what I had learned that he was growing up. The God I learned about, when I was growing up, my parents took us to church all the time. There was this one guy, he was like one of the major deacons, And he just thought he was so proud of himself. And he would say, I don't smoke, drink, or chew, and I don't mix with people that do. This was the problem I had. At that time, I was like 9, 10, 11 years old. My parents both smoked. So what does that mean? And I knew people that drank. Actually, I knew that this guy's kids partied. So what's that do? But I learned about a God who was very performance-based, ready to strike you with a lightning bolt anytime you stepped out of line, had expectations on you that you could not keep. That was the God that I had been taught. But the God who came and got me when I was hooked on meth and alcohol was not that same God. But this is the thing. The God I believed in was still not the right God. Still needed to begin to start this relationship with him so I could learn who he really was. And that's why when I talk about this, I talk about God not expecting perfection. He expects us to have the right perspective. With what's going on the inside of us, he wants us, as we're facing the situations and circumstances in our lives, to have the right perspective on who he is and who we are. Because if we're doing that, then when we make mistakes, it's not about the bad behavior. What it is that becomes a learning tool. It becomes a teachable moment for God to teach us how not to make those same choices, to teach us how not to get into those situations again. Because that was a big thing for me. I kept putting myself in bad situations expecting to overcome them. I expected different results out of the same behavior. And what God needed to do is to change my perspective so that I could see, well, yeah, I'm putting myself in these situations over and over again. Of course I'm going to get the same results. Going back to the thing about expectations, when Pam and I, we would keep having these arguments about the same thing. I would get so mad. She would hurt my feelings so bad because I felt like she was saying these things to me, but it was the tone of voice, not what she was saying. It was how she was saying it. And I automatically felt she felt this way. In the heat of this argument one day, I said, you said this, and I know, and I can't remember exactly how the words went. And I said, and I know that you meant blah, blah, blah. And she said, that's not even close to what I meant. This is what I meant. And it was just like, wait a minute. We still have challenges in our communications, right, Pam? Because I say and receive communication in one way, and she says and receives communication in another way. Remember, I talked about if our perspective is right, and we're not walking in judgment and bitterness and unforgiveness and hurt and anger, then when those things are said, I can rationally say, she probably doesn't mean that. And I can say, Pam, when you say that, it makes me feel like this is what you're saying. Is that true? And she could say, no, that's not what I'm saying. Or she can say, you got it right, buddy. You see what I'm saying? When all of the emotions aren't attached to it because of the wrong feelings and perception and all that, when they aren't there, I'm able to rationally work through it. And that's what God wants us to do. He wants to be able to get this junk off of us so that we can live our lives that way, not reacting to life, but we can live life in a real way. We can have a real life. They made this golden calf, just like we try and make a God when things are going ways we don't expect, we don't like, making us feel all those feelings that we don't like feeling. The Lord said to Moses, go, get down, for your people whom you brought. I think this is funny. God is blaming Moses. Your people who you brought out of Egypt. For your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way. Because remember, it's only been 40 days, which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, Let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make you a great nation. And Moses could have said, you know what, God, I think that's a good plan, because those people are out of control down there, and I think I would be a perfect person for you to make a new nation out of. That would have been what I would have done. Let's get real. But remember, Moses is a foreshadowing of Jesus, the Messiah. He's an imperfect man, but he's a foreshadowing of him. So, of course, what does Moses do? He says, oh, but wait, God. Then Moses pleaded with the Lord, his God, and said, Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. And that's exactly where Jesus comes in. Jesus comes in on our behalf, and when we do all of this stuff, and he says, God, I got this. I'm going to take care of this. It's going to be okay. And God says, okay, Jesus, will you straighten them people out down there? And Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hands, and the tablets were written on both sides. That was the 10 Commandments. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said, Moses, there's a noise of war in the camp. But Moses said, it's not the shout of victory, nor the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear. So it was, as soon as he came near the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing. So Moses' anger became hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Then he took the calf which they had made, burnt it in the fire, and ground it to powder, and he scattered it on the water and made the children of Israel drink it. And Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them? Listen to Aaron. You guys remember when I read the part about Aaron, and they said, hey, make us this, and he said, okay, give me some gold. So when Moses says, what did they do to you that was so great that caused you to do this? So Aaron said, don't let the wrath of my Lord become hot. You know the people. They're set on evil. Tell them guys, you know how they are. It wasn't my fault. For they said to me, make us gods that shall go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it to me, and I cast it into the fire, and this calf came out. Don't we do that? Isn't that like we are? God, I know I messed up. I know I did all this stuff. But, one, it wasn't my fault. You know how those people are. And two, I really didn't do it. It just kind of happened. And now when Moses saw that people were unrestrained, for Aaron had not restrained them to their shame among their enemies, then Moses stood in the entrance of the camp, and he said, whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. And he said to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, let every man put his sword on his side, and go in and out from the entrance to entrance throughout the camp, and let every man kill his brother, every man kill his companion, and every man kill his neighbor. So the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. Let me put this back into context, okay? Moses said, everybody who's with me, come over here. And now it said that all the Levites came, but that wasn't everybody that came. When they left Egypt, theologians and historians estimate, because they were in Egypt for 480 years, they estimated there was a little bit over 1 million, almost 1.5 million people left Egypt. Now, there were people that died here and there along the way. So this is actually a very small fraction. These are the people when Moses said, who's with the Lord? These people said, I'm not. I don't want to have any part of it. And so they went over there. You can also look at this. I believe he was talking about the whole thing. But you can also take this Levi, the sons of Levi were a part of the family of the 12 tribes. And they were responsible for worshiping God. They were the priest of that time. And so it had been assigned to them. And so you can also take this as when he says your brothers and your neighbors and your companions and all that, that they were fellow Levites who did not come when Moses said, who's with the Lord? In any rate, this is a small fraction. It wasn't like they just went and killed everybody indiscriminately. Now, what is the lesson behind this? I've talked to a lot of people, a lot of unbelievers. I've talked to a lot of drug addicts, alcoholics, people who've been through a lot of atheists, and I've talked to a lot of people. Number one thing is people don't like, if they believe that there might be a God, they look back to the Old Testament and they see him as a genocidal, murderous, horrible, evil being. And how could anybody possibly want to worship or follow all of this God who did all of this murdering and killing and all of that? And so I have to put into context and say, that's why I say this was a small percentage, but this is the reality of life. And this is the lesson, and this is what's so hard in this for us. Every choice you and I make has a consequence, or good or bad. And a consequence is, where that word comes from, it is the consecutive sequence of events that come next. If I say A, B, C, what comes next? D. That's the consecutive letter. If I say 1, 2, 3, 4 is the next. All of the choices in our life have consequences. This is the hardest part of it. And this is what's so crushing to addicts and alcoholics, or anybody in general. I don't know where everybody's at, but we are Real Life Recovery Church, so we're all recovering from something, trauma or PTSD or depression or anxiety or something. And this is the hard part. We look, and so many times we are willing to walk in the consequences of our choices to get what we want because of self-deception or denial and so many other things. We don't stop and think about what the real consequences are for the people around us. We don't stop and think that the decisions that we make today not only will give us the choices that are going to be able to make tomorrow, but they're also going to cause a set of choices for the people around us that love us. It's going to give them their choices. And you can say, well, that's not fair. They shouldn't have to do that. But that's the way it is. It's not about fair or unfair. It's about the reality of life. One of the huge factors in me getting clean is I looked, and I remember at 10 o'clock in the morning after a series of events, I'll give my testimony about it sometime, but I remember sitting and looking at that beer at 10 o'clock in the morning that I was drinking and all of the stuff that had happened in my life, all the consequences of the meth and everything, knowing that Pam was ready to leave. I thought my brother was going to be dead because of it. It turned out he had checked himself into a treatment center. But I looked at all that and I thought to myself, if I don't stop now, at that time I had a 2-year-old daughter. And I said to myself, if I don't stop now, she's going to grow up without a dad. I thought about that, and I thought what that meant. When we don't deal with these issues in our lives today, then everyone around us has to walk in the consequences of that. The Old Testament is stark reality of the realness of life. Back then, people actually died from things. You actually died from idolatry back then. We don't die, but we walk in the consequences of it. That's not punishment. It's a consequence, right? If you drink and then you drive a car, because your ability to operate that car is impaired, you are at some point, if you do that enough, you are going to crash into a tree or another car. That's the consequences for drinking and driving. It's not punishment. It's the natural consequences of what happened. And so then after you crash that car, you just incurred tremendous financial, legal, emotional, family consequences. You and everybody around you have to walk the natural consequences of that. If we learn the right perspective, this is the cool thing about Jesus. He says that he didn't come to condemn the world, but to save it. And so, when we make these choices, if we have the right perspective, they become teaching moments. We may or may not walk in the consequences of that. It all depends on whether or not we need to learn another lesson from that. Maybe you'll walk in the consequences of it, maybe you won't. If you recognize what's going on, if you recognize that you've got the wrong perspective, talk to God about it, that gives him the ability to remove the consequences from it, to save you from that, to make things work differently in your life. And this is not just a theory that I came up with. This is the gospel of the kingdom. This is the true gospel. This ain't the gospel about raise your hand, say a prayer, and when you die, you're going to heaven. That's just a minuscule part of what the gospel is. The real gospel is God puts you on this path through the wilderness to strip all of this stuff away so that you no longer have to walk in the fullness of those consequences. If you're like me, I never learned things the easy way. I never really learned my lesson by watching other people. I have to learn the hard way by doing dumb stuff and walking in the consequences. And so it took me a long time. Hopefully it won't take you. I stayed clean. And believe me, you guys, I won't tell you the age of my oldest daughter, but when I got clean, she was 2. I've been clean for 34 years. My grandchildren will never know that guy. They will never have to walk in the consequences of that Bob. My children had to walk in some of those consequences because I was such a knucklehead. It took about 10 years for things to, maybe not, maybe I'm exaggerating. Things did begin to change right away. But it wasn't until I really began to understand how a relationship with God can actually change things. When I stopped pretending to be somebody I wasn't, when I stopped playing church, when I stopped pretending like I was a good person, and I got real, and I entered into this relationship with God with this perspective of, God, this is where I'm at, and I see way out there where I want to be. Can you help me get there? Started heading in the right direction then. Guys, I'm not perfect. I still got issues. I'm growing day by day. I'm not the man I was. I'm not the man I was a year ago. But I'm walking in the promises of God. Maybe tonight it's something that provoked something in you, either good or bad. Hopefully not bad. But maybe that is a good thing. Maybe you're thinking about the consequences that you've walked in. Maybe you're mad because you're thinking about the consequences that somebody is making you walk in. Even that, if we're walking in the right perspective, God can even remove those consequences from you so that you don't have to walk in the consequences of other people's stupid. But we're imperfect, but God does keep us from walking in the consequences of each other's issues because we're in this path. And so if you're at that point today and you're like, well, Bob, you said it took 10 years for you. I just can't hold on for 10 years. That's all right. You don't have to. I've seen God do it so many times, and suddenly hell could be breaking loose around them, and they're like, everything's wonderful. God is so awesome. I got to tell the world how good God is. I also know that there are people who've only been clean for 5 years and have caught up to me for 34 years. There's no time on this. It can happen fast or it can happen slow. It could take you 40 years to wander the wilderness, or it could be 40 days like Jesus did it, or anywhere in between. But it all starts with the first step.
Thanks for listening. Please comment and subscribe for upcoming podcasts. To order your copy of My Real Life, go to the Take Action page at our website, reallifeministries-stl.com, or go to Real Life Ministries STL on Facebook.